Good evening. Good evening. Can you hear me? Good evening. Good evening. Thank you all for coming to Shapes of Time, a symposium supported in part by the J. Irwin Miller Endowment here at the Yale School of Architecture. My name, for those of you that don't know me, is Anthony Acevadi. I teach here in the School of Architecture. I, along with Morgan Ng, who teaches in the history of art here at Yale, collaborated with Professor and Assistant Dean Pelkonen on the symposium this evening. However, I should say that Evelisa really is the chief convener of the event tonight. We would also like to thank Dean Deborah Burke, along with Associate Deans Phil Bernstein and Sunil Bold, all here at the School of Architecture, as well as Richard DeFlumery. As you all know, this is a 2.5-day event here at the school, which brings together an interdisciplinary group of artists, architects, curators, scholars, and scientists to investigate the role time plays in their respective fields and in their individual scholarly creative pursuits. By taking a transdisciplinary approach to the ways in which time manifests in different cultures and religions around the globe, Shapes of Time foregrounds time as medium and method. Last night we had a wonderful lecture by Casey and Deegan of Taka Architects, whose work deals intimately with the shapes of time. And tonight it is a distinct pleasure to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Dr. Dipesh Chakrabarty, whose work has long taken a transdisciplinary approach to time as both medium and method. And tonight he'll deliver a talk titled Scaling the Political, the Challenge of the Planetary. Dr. Chakrabarty is the Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor of History, South Asian Languages and Civilizations, and the college at the University of Chicago. Trained initially in physics at Presidency College, University of Calcutta, then a master's degree at IIM in Calcutta, and a PhD in history from the Australian National University. He is a founding member of the editorial collective Subaltern Studies, a consulting editor of Critical Inquiry, and a founding editor of Postcolonial Studies. He has also served on the editorial boards of the American Historical Review and Public Culture. Professor Chakrabarty is the author of 6 books in English, which have been translated into many, many languages. His work has long shaped so many scholars' work, and I can say certainly my own after first reading Provincializing Europe as a graduate student at Princeton. One of Chakrabarty's powers, or better yet, I'd really call it a superpower, is his ability to reperiodize the past, not only reorienting how we perceive its rhythms and breaks, but also opening up so many new vistas for historians, but also so many scholars across the arts and sciences. His work is at once firmly rooted in South Asia, but also situates South Asia within the world. It should come as no surprise that Professor Chakrabarty has been awarded honorary degrees from the University of London and University of Antwerp, the Toynbee Prize for Contributions to Global History, the Sarkar Memorial Gold Medal from the Asiatic Society of Bengal, and is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a Fellow of the British Academy. More recently, and perhaps most fittingly for this evening, in 2023, he published One Planet, Many Worlds, The Climate Parallax. Please join me in welcoming Professor Chakrabarty.
Thank you. Am I audible? Yes. You can hear me? So I should explain. If you find me mumbling, just find a way of letting me know, because I've just begun to wear spectacles for my ears, and my problem is reversed. I can hear myself very well, but sometimes because I'm hearing myself very well, I don't speak loudly enough. So if you have any problem hearing me, let me know. So thank you again, Anthony, for the very warm welcome, and of course, thanks to Professor Pelkonen for having me here to address you. And just come back. We just come here from a wonderful session by Anthony Flog? Yeah. It was a wonderful session where he made a statement which because of the wonderful time we had with him, kind of made me realize that this is really coming down from what was happening upstairs, the level of it. He said, Aaron said, and I took it down, he said, talking is really cool, but making music is better. And I can't compete with that. I totally agree with that. Unfortunately, I can't sing my way through this. I wish I could. It would have been more enjoyable. But what I will do, though, as Anthony warned you, I'll probably try to periodize our past in the lecture. And talk about how I come to that periodization, and use that periodization as a way of thinking about what I think of as the human condition today. Now, the expression "the human condition" itself has a heritage, of course, most recently from Hannah Arendt. But the interesting thing about it is that when it raises this question, can you say the human condition when there are so many human beings who are all different? And I would, of course, try to argue, like she did, that yes, you could. I mean, there is an interesting way in which that figure of the one, the human condition, can actually contain plurality. And that would be the part of the problem that I talk about today. A condition we share differently. So to begin with, when I started to take an interest in climate change, and I've been working on climate change for about almost close to 15 years now, I realized it was already good 15 years after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had been set up. And I happened to be one of the early humanists to take an interest in what climate change was. So I'm just telling this story to explain to you that humanists were already late in taking interest in climate change. And then it was some consolation to me to see somebody much more gifted than I am, Professor Charles Meyer from Harvard, writing an article in American Historical Review in the year 2000. So bidding goodbye to the previous century, and the article called Consigning the 20th Century to History. A very good article, mentioned everything about the 20th century except climate change. And that was good 12 years after the IPCC had been set up. So I was not the only one not listening about climate change. And there's a connection between our not listening, why we were not listening to the story about global warming, and why I felt compelled to listen when I came across the problem. I'm by birth a Bengali, a bunch of loquacious people, so I need to time myself. Just make sure that I will stop maybe around 55 minutes and leave time for questions. So start my timer. The reason why I took interest was, personally, because there was a huge fires in Australia around the city of Canberra, where I did my PhD work and where I actually discovered the outdoors, or the bush, as the Australians called it, and fell in love with it. And all the nature spots around the city got absolutely gutted by huge fires in 2003, when the country was going through a very bad drought. And about 300 houses were lost to the fires, about 30 people died, big. And the country was going through a drought, so that it was dry, fires were not unexpected, but I kept asking all my friends out of a sense of bereavement, why were the fires so bad? Because Australia gets cyclical fires because the gum trees need them for self-generation. And I said, is it the drought? And they said, it's not a normal drought, this is climate change. And when I began to read up on climate change, out of that sense of mourning, what immediately stood out was a statement made by many geologists and scientists of climate change saying human beings, thanks to their numbers, consumption, and technology, have become a geological agent. And I'd been brought up on E.P. Thompson, subaltern studies, and agency was a good word. You had to give peasants their agency, indigenous people their agency, women their agency. Claiming agency was like claiming the status of being the subject of history and not objects of history. Whereas geological agency meant you were like a force. And later on, my colleague in Chicago, David Archer, in his book, which he published in 2009, with the subtitle How Humans Are Changing the Climate of this Planet for the Next 100,000 Years, he actually said, we have an impact. We don't feel it, but we have an impact on other forms of life on this planet, which is like the impact that the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs had. So, in other words, he was saying that we may not feel this, but we have a thing-like existence. And it took me back, and then I began to think, so why was Professor Maya not interested? Why was I not interested? And then I realized that basically what they were saying was that human history had become inseparable from natural history. So we are a kind of a natural force on this planet. But I grew up in a Western historiographical tradition, which was premised on a separation from natural history and human history, the separation between the two. And there were very good reasons for it. I realized that basically it begins early in the 19th century. It begins with philosophers like Hegel and others who argue, given the state of science those days, and you can find roots of it in Kant, that while nature is subject to her own laws that the scientists discover, and these were supposed to be iron laws, nature therefore being the domain of necessity. Nature couldn't get out of necessity. The human world, in 19th century philosophical terms, was the domain of necessity and freedom that humans choose. And that understanding, whether people went back to it or not, stayed through historiography and flared up that debate about freedom quite a few times, but again famously in the 1930s between the Oxford philosopher of history and an archaeologist, Robin Collingwood, and people like A.N. Whitehead, the scientists, Sam Alexander, who were actually claiming everything was historical, that physics studies the history of the cosmos, biology studies history of life, geology studies history of the planet. So human history is just like that, part of that. And Collingwood was very upset. And he said, no. Things have chronology. And he used the word things because Sam Alexander had just written an article called The Historicity of Things. So I have a chapter in my the last book, One Planet, Many Worlds, called The Historicity of Human Things, or Humanity as a Thing. And Collingwood was vehemently angry with that, saying things have chronology, things are time full, they exist in time, but things don't have history because things don't choose between good and bad. We humans choose. So because we make meanings, and therefore, he said, while our bodily functions are biological, when they have some social meaning, causes social conflict or whatever, that's when they become historical. And that message was repeated by the very famous English historian E.H. Carr in his Trevelyan lectures of 1958 that came out soon after, in the early 1960s, there's a book called What is History, which is still, I think, one of the bestsellers. And it goes back through Collingwood, who was also a translator of the Italian philosopher Croce, who himself was saying this, making this point early in the 20th century in his History as the Story of Liberty. who had got it from a German political economist who preached this point that you can't equate natural history with human history, against a German historian of the 19th and early 20th century called Karl Lamprecht, who used to say you can find patterns in human history that are similar to patterns in natural history. So this breach between human history and natural history had something to do with different iterations of the idea of freedom. So the idea of freedom became emancipation from slavery for women, castes, and of course from colonial rule in the 20th century. So you can say that the 19th century and up to the middle of the 20th century, human history was a story of freedom. Subaltern studies, however you think about it, feminist histories, these are all figurations of freedom. And freedom was the theme. And therefore the separation between human history and natural history was very important. But what was significant about climate change was that the claim that the scientists were making seemed to kind of blast open one of the assumptions of my discipline. And that's why I took an interest. I thought, wow, now here's a door that I thought would never open. It had been flung open by events in public life in the world. And I thought, what happens if I walk out of the door? What do I see? So I walked through the door, published my first response in the shape of 4 theses called The Climate of History. Basically, I was talking to my colleague in the English department, Bill Brown, trying to explain to him, I'd written this essay, and it had 4 theses. And I was trying to explain that, Bill, what I'm trying to argue is that climate change changes the climate of my discipline. So it was Bill who came up with the title, The Climate of History. And I think it's one wonderful title, very grateful to him. And it immediately attracted a lot of attention, not all friendly to me. In fact, a lot of it was very hostile. And I was criticized for, again, uniting humanity into the figure of humanity, species, whatever. Some people wanted to blame capitalism. And that's been my struggle with thinking the oneness of humanity and its differentiation together. And in different books, I'm working on another book 3 lectures I have to give in Cambridge next year. And what I'm presenting to you kind of is both summarizing what I've done so far and looking forward to what I might want to do in those lectures. So I'm very interested in your responses. So what I discovered as I was working through global warming and coming out of the question of freedom in the years of globalization, we had always thought that from the 1990s we were becoming global. And while I was working on this, a French philosopher, Catherine Malabou, first said to me, Dipesh, you realize that we are using the word global in globalization and global warming, but it's not the same globe we are talking about. So that was an interesting suggestion. As I worked through it, I realized that, yes, indeed, because historians had evolved the idea of the globe, which is really the story of 500 years of European expansion, taking over other people's land, enslaving people, dominating people, but also creating the infrastructure for a global economy and eventually a global media. And that's the globe. So the globe was human-made. It was made through capitalism, the history of capitalism, the history of empires, all of those, the histories of inequality. While the globe of global warming was something, and which contained a human story, was coming out of the Cold War, competition in space, colonization of the idea of colonizing Mars, the work of Carl Sagan in that unit in NASA. And as they were asking questions about what makes a planet habitable, and they had employed James Lovelock, an English kind of chemist, but also a very good instrument maker, in Carl Sagan's team, it was Lovelock who actually realized, looking at this planet and the history of life on it, that you could not simply put whatever Elon Musk think about this project. You can't simply send humans to Mars and terraform it without first bacteria doing what they have done in the history of life on this planet. So in one of those meetings, he said, don't worry about sending humans, just send some bacteria. Just make it ready for bacteria, because they're so fundamental to the history of life that they will make the planet habitable for us, if at all. So out of that came this idea that history of life, understanding history of life matters in understanding why a planet becomes habitable. And this question of what makes a planet habitable is really what was at the heart of these scientists trying to understand both other planets and this planet. And Lovelock, as many of you would know, came up with the idea of Gaia, that there's a homeostasis-like process whereby life itself helps to maintain the conditions for life. The Gaia idea was not eventually scientifically accepted, but it sort of mutated through the 70s, 80s into a new interdisciplinary scientific discipline called Earth System Science. So NASA set up its first Earth System Science subcommittee in 1983. But the basic point, which actually I didn't understand so clearly when I wrote my fourth history essay, was that on a planet like this one, with life on it, and complex life like ours, multicellular life for 500,000 years, you can't separate geology from biology. Having life means there's more oxygen. Having more oxygen means we have more minerals than other planets, because there's oxidation process that changes things. So you can't, life itself acts as a geological force. Now we now understand. So you can't separate biology from geology. So people now talk about the geobiology of this planet. But for me, the interesting thing was, I'm a historian, as I explored this distinction between what I began to call globe, meaning the globe of globalization, and the planet, meaning this Earth system. What I began to do, first of all, I began to say periodization. We are no longer just in the history of globalization, understood as a human-centered category. The very intensity of globalization, and that's something I'm going to talk about, the very intensity of globalization, that is the drawing of China, India, these populous nations, opening up their economies, hastening up their development, and the new middle classes of Africa, Latin America, and other places. That very fact has revealed to us how much we depend on this planet and its life support system, while the planet doesn't depend on us to keep the life support system going. We could destroy the life support system, but we don't keep it going. So suddenly the planet became a way of decentering human beings. So in some ways it became another kind of history making, and I thought the scientists were writing those history. So in a way, the histories of freedom coming out of decolonization, coming out of all the 20th century struggles, indigenous people struggles, civil liberties struggles, these were all different figurations of freedom. In my mind, suddenly met up with the other story about humanity, which people were talking about from the 1950s. From the 1890s or even slightly earlier, for 100 years, it was known to scientists that carbon dioxide has something to do with increasing temperature of the atmosphere. But it really wasn't getting taken seriously until the Cold War happened, until the competition in space happened, until we had nuclear bombs, and the President of America got advice every year on the state of the world's atmosphere because they had wanted to know the fallout, what the bombs were doing. And it was then that money came into atmospheric sciences. And this man, Charles Keeling in Hawaii, who was just out of his own expenses keeping a tab on temperature around Hawaii, got funding to keep that going. And this whole story of, is the planet warming up, became a question for everybody. So, let me just look at time and see how much time I've Okay, I've got about 40 minutes, 39 minutes. So let's spend 10 minutes on this. But what has happened in my head is that I've reperiodized it. So if you read my work on climate change up to last year, you will find that I'm kind of working through this distinction between the planet and the globe to say that we are living on the cusp of the global and the planetary, that we have these two different perspectives on us, ourselves. One is about us as the maker of the globe through our exploitation of each other, enslavement, appropriation, all of those things. The other one is what collectively our roles be. Now, and as I think about it, and I look at this map, I really think for most of human history, human beings had ways of remembering the planet. They did not know about Earth system, but seasons mattered. See, all of our ancestors were either hunters and gatherers, or in the last 10, 12,000 years, peasants. Now, even if you study a peasant society, and I was growing up in an India that was predominantly peasant, even though I was a city-bred boy, but we always had a peasant in residence, the people who used to work for our family, the servants. And there's no middle class in India without servants. Most of the servants used to be peasants who were migrating from the countryside. You grew up with peasant proverbs about when to sow, when to reap. Recently we had this solar eclipse, and there are proverbs about what the lunar eclipse does to rain and all kinds of stuff. So whether it rained or kind of whether there was sunshine, too much or too little mattered to people. So in that sense, seasons mattered. So I would say that most of human history, if I had to periodize it now, I'd say you could somehow think of it as being at one with the planet, even without having planetary science, simply through experience. And it's not at all a surprising fact of today that 80% of biodiversity hotspots are where indigenous people are. So at least you know that they have a lifestyle, even today, which is more sustainable. And how sustainable was amazing. Sometimes you read about when I was in Australia, I encountered, of course, Aboriginal history and their history. One of the things you find out from archaeologists in Australia who work on Aboriginal history is that there are places in the country on the coast where Aboriginal people would go and kind of roast mussels and eat them. Roast them on sort of, hot rocks, sort of heated by sunshine, and throw the shells just there on the spot. So over time, these shells have created little mountains, which are called middens. And you can actually date them radioactively. Some of the middens are like 5,000 years, 6,000 years old, which means for 5,000 years, people have gone to the same spot, done the same thing. You can't imagine that kind of stability in our kind of societies. So there's no question that these were very sustainable societies. And as I said, whether you're peasant or the seasons mattered. So let's think of this period as a time when season mattered, when the seasons mattered. If you look at the history of post-industrial humanity, it's basically a technology and urbanization. You could also look on technology and urbanization as a history of forgetting the planet. That distinction between human history and natural history was an instance of forgetting the connection between natural history and human history, which indigenous people and peasants had, Europeans had. Many of the biblical histories are actually about connections, 18th century biblical histories. But it's really through the Enlightenment, and eventually it gets solidified by the development of history of disciplines, that you get this separation. So I would periodize this 200 years, let's say, but increasingly as a period of the planet being forgotten. And I would argue that when you come to the mid-20th century, the more we develop stronger sense of justice, the more we develop stronger sense of freedom, the less we try to connect the idea of freedom with what the earth did. In other words, what Wittgenstein, or before Wittgenstein, actually Schopenhauer, would have described as the sense of the world being given to us, sometimes called the givenness of the world. That became solidified. In his essays in that book called Uncertainty, Wittgenstein asks a very interesting question. He says, when we look at a building, we ask, how old is this building? Why don't we ask it of a mountain? Today, actually, we are asking that of mountains. The answer is very clear, that the mountain exists on a scale of time, connecting with the question of time, that is so long for humans that we can take it as a given. Whereas the building exists more or less in human time. If you leave your building to your children, you wonder if the building will last till the next following generation, right? So that the world was being taken more or less as given. There are many, and seasons cease to matter. So, when I look at British history in India, one of the things that the British were very proud of early on of their achievements in India was building what they called all-weather roads. Roads you could travel no matter what the weather was. Before the British came, even wars were seasonal. You had to stop fighting if you couldn't cross a river that was in full tide. Sometimes your powder got wet by the rains. So when the railways came to France, this is a story repeated everywhere, but even the famous philosopher Joseph Pierre Proudhon, whom Marx polemicized against in The Poverty of Philosophy, he wrote purple passages in the praise of railways saying, now we can travel in any weather. And just to give you another quick instance, I grew up in Calcutta or Kolkata knowing that mango was a summer fruit. Now I eat mango right through the year. They don't always taste well because they come out of these cold storages. But I mentioned cold storages, so you can see that technology and urban life, it gave us a capacity to forget the planet. And it's an irony of our history, our technological capacity to forget the planet, that is the capacity that made us forget the planet. It's the capacity that actually allowed us to think about freedom in very distinctive ways. It's that same capacity that one day told us how we were actually interfering with the very conditions of our existence. The first such warning was the hole in the ozone layer in the 1980s, which led to the Montreal Protocol, and that's the beginning, really. So it's no wonder that Earth system science comes together in 1983. The ozone hole is one of the first kind of signs that we were doing something to the climate, to things that protect us. That layer protects. I still remember I was in Australia and suddenly there were all these sort of advertisements, public advertisement by the government telling people to wear sunscreen. I still remember the slogan was slip, slop, slap or whatever. Put on your sunscreen before you go to the beach. And as they love their beaches, because they said the hole, I used to imagine the hole just right on top of Australia. So in a way, then there was this period of forgetting the planet. And now, I would say we're entered a period of the shock of the planetary. So we discovered the planet, we rediscovered the planet through a crisis that seemed existential. Now, this forgetting of the planet reaches, I think, its crescendo in the early part of the mid-20th century, in the 1950s. And America is of Soviet Union too, but America is one of the key actors in this story. And that it's a story that influences all developing nations, which is that, like in the 19th century, the British used to worry about if they would have enough coal to keep the empire going. So in the 19th century, people used to think about this expression, peak coal? When will we run out of coal? In the 20th century, from the 30s on, Americans were talking about whether they would run out of oil, peak oil. And the interesting thing was, they thought of oil as stock. Like there's so much reserve, so much in the reservoir, and you're drawing it down. So when will it end? It was in the 1950s, early 1950s, maybe 1952, there was a commission called the Paley Commission, William Paley Commission, that was set up by the American government to look at this whole question of what happens, how do you think of scarcity, scarce resources. And that commission began to argue, along with other economists, that scarcity is not an absolute scarcity of anything. Scarcity is relative to price. In other words, there's always more if you can pay for it. There's a sentence in the commission reports which says pretty much that. And it's relative eventually, not the Paley Commission, eventually other economists would say, it's also relative to technology. You can make substitutes for things. So this idea that economic growth did not have to be limited by the apparent scarcity of a particular resource, like oil, was being argued. And this was the time when, MIT becomes a fascinating institution, which by the 1970s also debating this question of growth, because it's another MIT economist who would write, and his team write a book called Limits to Growth in 1972, right? The Club of Rome, that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. But William Rostow, again another MIT economist, wrote a very famous book that influenced many countries called Stages of Economic Growth. So this idea that growth was something that you could pursue independent of this apparent scarcity of resources has been visited on oil, has been visited on the energy question, it's been visited on food. So the Green Revolution was again seen as another instance where technology would enable you to grow more food. And I'm not at all surprised that it's in these years, from the 1960s to the 1990s, that the question of freedom becomes intense, including in economics. So when the book called Limits to Growth came out in 1972, Robert Solow, another Nobel-winning economist from MIT, gave a very famous lecture in 1974. It was called The Economics of Resources and the Resources of Economics. Gave it to the American Economic Association. And his argument, as well as the argument of other economists who were working on this question, was that so long as technology could create a substitute for a resource, and so long as you could pay to get that resource from somewhere else, there was no scarcity. And a very famous line said, if a resource gets exhausted, then its exhaustion is an event, not a catastrophe. So this idea of completely liberating, first of all, so they give up on the idea of there being a stock, a finite reservoir, but also liberating the idea of growth from finitude of resources and giving technology a certain role, and the idea that by expanding volume, you can solve all problems, eventually affected all kinds of thoughts. I'll just give you 4 examples. Bill Gates published a book last year. It's a very important book called Averting or Avoiding a Climate Disaster. A very smart book. He's a smart man. He also says in the beginning, I'm a white man with a lot of money and opinions. But he backs up his opinions, unlike many other white men. Then Vaclav Smil, the wonderful Canadian historian of science, has a book called How the World Really Works. I'm just naming people. Then think of Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen's development of capability theories in the 1990s. You will find that running through all that is one assumption. And Bill Gates states it, Vaclav Smil states it, Nussbaum states it, which is that every human being has the right to have a healthy, Gates says productive, Newsom doesn't say productive, but he says full human life, including living out whatever is the lifespan. And one of the interesting things about the human capacity to marginalize seasons and weather was also that we also developed the capacity to sustain more human beings, to keep more human beings alive. So if you look back, going back to 18th century, average life expectancy was about 30 years. Which doesn't mean that everybody died at 30. It means a lot of children died. Right? But if you made past those barriers, you could live up to 50 or 60. Before the Second World War, it was 50 in the world. Today it's over 70. My pension advisors say I should plan. I don't. They say I should plan to live until my mid-90s, but who knows? Such misfortune may befall me. But this is a story of, so you have to include medical technology into the story of technology, include antibiotics, include hygiene, include public health programs. So when I go back and look at post-colonial criticism that I was part of the 1980s, 90s, I often ask myself why we were not interested in the environment. Rob Nixon's book, Slow Violence, comes out probably in 2011. And I think because we were all participating in this thought that the basic problem was of distributive justice. I would hear people in India tell me, social scientists or administrative people, that caste inequality was a capacity problem. If we create enough industries, enough jobs, this will do. This is just a way that people want to compete with each other. So the assumption of growth, assumption, in other words, there are different figurations of justice. And that got tied to the idea of growth implicitly, even when people didn't think about it. And until growth began to create problems. And really this growth began to create problems in those same years when we became intense about freedom from the 1950s, and becomes more and more intense as the years go on, because as India and China enter the market, and particularly China, things accelerate. So what happens is, so when you look at human numbers, we are a 300,000-year-old species. For the bulk of our history, we are hunters and gatherers. We reached the figure 1 billion, 1.6 in 1900. 2000, we're 6 billion. Today, 8. Smil says 40% of humanity wouldn't survive without ammonia and modern fertilizers, by his calculations. There is a geologist called Peter Haff at Duke, just retired, who argued very interestingly that if we withdrew all the technology and everything that connects us, including the technology to control temperature. So mind you, without refrigeration, we wouldn't have been able to deal with the pandemic, because it meant producing the vaccine, storing it in cold temperature, transporting it across the oceans. So you needed refrigerated containers, and then storing it again for distribution. All this capacity to control temperature, impossible. And Schmidt actually says that there are 4 substances in our life that we can't do without: glass, steel, concrete, and plastics. Ammonia, steel, concrete, and plastics. Ammonia you need for fertilizers. So when I look through these books and see this is a reigning consensus. What is the consensus about? Why is it so difficult to deal with climate change? it's very clear to me that it is not people are not necessarily defending, at least when you read these people, defending a consumerist lifestyle, defending excessive meat eating is not what they do. They come back, whether it's Bill Gates or it's Václav Smil or Sen or Nussbaum or somebody like myself, we come back to a sense of justice, which includes the thought that reducing child mortality is a non-negotiable. So however we go forward, maintaining lifespans. Most Americans spend their medical expenses in the last year of their life without knowing that it's the last year of their life. But when things get tough, you see it with cancer patients all the time. Recently I lost a very close relative to cancer. And she had ovarian cancer. I encouraged her to take the medicine, go through the treatment. She did, and she got 3 years out of it. But it's the treatment that killed her. The same treatment, but in the end, we were happy that she got 3 years out of it. So what has also happened is that the more we developed a capacity to sustain human life, the more human life itself became a value. And with the exception of Gandhi, it would be very hard to find an anti-colonial thinker who would argue for child mortality. Gandhi did, in effect. And so it seems to me that that's kind of non-negotiable. And it's with this non-negotiable in mind, I want to talk about what we're looking forward to. And not only talk about the shapes of time this creates, but also the shapes of time we can create out of this. So just want to quickly show you some slides now. So these are, some of you will know these slides, very well known. So these are slides of the Great Acceleration that the Earth System scientists working with John McNeill, the environmental historian, produced. And basically what you see, I haven't gone to the next slide. Now you can see it. What you see is how things go exponentially from 1950 on. If you didn't have climate in mind, this would be a story of human flourishing. This is the story of our numbers increasing, our being able to sustain more people, feed them, the invention of modern agriculture, Mill's point that 40% of us wouldn't be around. The Peter Haff, the geologist I mentioned, he makes the argument that if you took all the connectivity away, I forgot to finish that point, that the number of humans would crash to 11 million. He said that's what the world would support without technology. And as I said, the non-negotiable, if I talk about the life of an old person, you might say, okay, look, what does it matter? They had a good long life. If I talk about the life of a child, you will say, of course, we are against child mortality. We are against maternal mortality, things that actually killed human beings, things that kept. So it was a good thing that we were able to save people, but we have saved large numbers of people. And the population graph goes like that. On its own, this would be what I call a Steve Pinker story. The Harvard psychologist who argues that things are getting better and better for human beings. They are in a sense. And I think the post-colonial movement, and I would say even the decolonial movement, I don't know of any intellectual who would say we should not feed 8 billion people. So, and those are the other graphs, which are basically showing what the planet was doing as we were flourishing. And here again, the ozone curve has to do with the depletion of the ozone layer. And basically, these graphs are, they've been actually brought forward by later graphs. The story remains the same. And this does not prove that the first graph causes this one, but it suggests a correlation. And again, it's going exponential from 1950 on. So it's out of that. I'll just quickly go through these are just bringing the story forward. So let me quickly go through these points and we can pick them up in discussion. So as I said, the global is human-made and humanocentric. The planetary, the Earth system, is a human construct, but decenters the human. Global belongs to the recorded history of 500 years. The planetary is about deep history, the geobiological history of the Earth system. And basically we talk about the Earth system that we are living in through, like, say, 500,000 years old, mostly. The globe is uniquely and singularly human. But the planet, Earth system, is a comparative category, which is why you can say, what would it require to make Mars habitable? Or what makes a planet habitable? So even though we have historians very comfortable with this, sample size of 1, but big generalizations. But basically they try to extrapolate from the history of life on this planet to other questions about other planets. Sustainability belongs to the global and is human-centric. So sustainability is the question of how do I leave the planet livable, sustainable for future humans. That's how the Brundtland Commission defined it. The planetary is about how to keep this planet habitable for other forms of life. That is how to sustain biodiversity. Biodiversity is a condition for all of us, for the lives of all of us. And we've been, of course, impacting on biodiversity badly. So the global is a human-dominant order of life. The planetary reminds that humans are a minority form of life. So if all forms of life were human, and if the dominant humans were white, this would look like apartheid. So it actually calls on us to develop some minoritarian forms of thinking with regard to other forms of life. And after plants, the majority forms of life by numbers are microbial. And it goes back to the story. And one of the fascinating stories here is, of course, the oxygen in the atmosphere. And there are 2 stories. I'll tell you the first one. So we are very grateful that we have oxygen in the air, so we breathe. All that syncopation that Aaron was talking about, having lungs, having heart, having the heartbeat, the pulse, all that is kept going by this oxygen. This oxygen has to be constantly supplied to the air because the oxygen mixes up with other gases. It's a very reactive gas. So the air needs fresh oxygen. Who produces this fresh oxygen? 50 or 60% of it is produced by phytoplanktons. So these algae-like oceanic plants. If the oceans become very hot, the phytoplanktons will die and will lose 50% of the supply of oxygen. And if you ask how long have they done it for? So they have done it for almost 400 million years. So we are beneficiaries of it. But these so-called inferior forms of life have a huge role. But I was going to say that 2.5 billion years ago, it was really, again, algae and bacteria that actually transformed the atmosphere and made it put out more oxygen. It used to be much more nitrogen, still is. It was such a change that many nitrogen-fixing bacteria and forms of life were immediately killed, to a degree that scientists call that a great oxidation event an oxygen holocaust. So one of the things you realize when you look at history of life, about which we have to be mindful, justice is not a part of the history of life, the way we think about justice. I mean, my friend Ashil Membe wrote a very interesting essay during the Black Lives Matter movement and the murder that saddened us all in that year, called The Right to Breathe. And of course we have a right to breathe. But if you look at the history of life, it's not based, for majority forms of life, microbial structures, on notions of justice. The very idea of justice evolves at a certain point with certain animals. We are, and humans are a kind of animals that are very keen on the idea of justice, while they're also very poor at giving it, when it's their turn to give it. And that is, the world is full of instances which will tell you that we feel wronged, and rightly so, but when we wrong others, it takes us a very long time to recognize that. I mean, that's the history of slavery, that's the history of caste oppression, all of those things. So these are just So the global is about a human dominant, I've said that. The globe, the earth, the world are about mutuality between humans and the earth. That is to say that we are programmed, I mean, Edward Wilson used to call it biophilia. We are programmed to feel that this planet is good for us, and it is good for us. And Heidegger says, when you approach a fruit-bearing tree, it is as though this earth is rising as the sap in the tree and greeting you with a piece of fruit. And a lot of existential philosophers have actually philosophized what they think of as this mutuality, that I greet the earth and the earth greets me back. You find it in religion. I find it in Tagore, for instance, in my own culture. But the oxygen story tells you that the earth system does not return our gaze. There's no mutuality. That's why it's shocking. It's shocking to be decentered. This waking up to the planetary is shocking because you suddenly realize you are not the end point. You are not the reason why oxygen exists. Even if we hadn't come along, oxygen would have been there because it also services other forms of life. So that's why the globe is a moral political category. The planetary reduces us to our creaturely lives. So when there's a tsunami, when there's a devastation, you only want to survive. I mean, with man-made devastation, but also with devastation that we consider natural, though our actions can actually cause earthquakes too. When you only want to survive, and this is the point that Aristotle makes, Hannah Arendt makes, but Kant used to make, that Rousseau used to make, that surviving is what animals do. And of course, when we talk about poor people's, marginalized people's politics of survival, what we are saying is that we find more than survival. We find something moral. We find resistance. We find something that is like protest. That's why when we glorify the expression politics of survival, we're actually saying it's not animal-like survival. It's human-like. But there was a case, but when there were huge fires in Australia in 1920, there was a place in South Australia where camels were actually competing for water with a group of humans. And the government of South Australia planned to kill or cull 10,000 feral camels. The camels have an interesting imperial history. Not going into it. Imperial colonial history. But you see, when you use helicopter gunships to kill camels, it's like you are just adding to your nails and your teeth. That's like you're trying to become a bigger animal that can kill that smaller animal. That's creaturely in a Kantian biblical sense. And that's not political. So that's why I said technology, urbanization, marginalization of citizens. The planetary is both macro and micro. Let me just say this. How much time do I have? I may come back to some of these points in the Q&A. I've got over 5 minutes, so I won't go over 10. Promise. So macro and micro, the pandemic itself was a very interesting story of the global and the planetary. The vaccination story, the politics of vaccination, unequal access to vaccination, was absolutely about human justice, politics, global transport of vaccinations. But the story of the coronavirus was almost a Darwinian story. That virus now has a global address, thanks to us, because we are very mobile, we live in crowded cities, we are large in numbers, and that was part of the planetary history. Something has changed in the Darwinian history of the planet. So the planet, the Earth system, is not the same as nature. Nature is something that humans confront, whether you think through Hegel, Marx. The Earth system is abstract. It doesn't directly index human experience. So it talks about the role that deep oceans play in maintaining the climate, or the Atlantic conveyor belt, warm waters, which was discovered in the 60s or 70s, by a Columbia University professor, what that role plays, the role that glaciers play, the role that the Amazon forests play, right? So it's not directly related to what we experience out there. And the personal is not only political, it is also planetary. It is definitely deep historical. So sometimes I say to my students, just to give them a sense of how your perspective changes when you take into account the deep history of the planet, I ask them, how old is your body? And of course, a student would say, my body it's as old as I am. It was born with me, it'll die with me. And then I say, but how old do you think it took evolution to design that body? And then you realize, not only did it take millions of years, your body is actually connected to other kinds of bodies. I mean, if not, you would not have been able to test medicine on other animals and other creatures and then use it on human bodies if we didn't have the dotted line relationship. When Aaron was talking about beat and our response to beat, it's like grammar. Our bodies are almost programmed to respond to beat, to that sense of time. I mean, some do it better than others, but you see it in a child, dancing, and some cultures develop in distinct ways. And so let me tell you the story of. I'll end with the Sundarban story and the sand story quickly. So this is from the part of India that I'm from, in the Delta region, called Sundarbans, which is shared. The delta is shared between Bangladesh and India. And because of the rise of the sea level, the rivers in the estuary are becoming more salty in the water. And there are poor women from fishing communities who stand waist deep in rivers and catch small fish with baskets. And while the fish are changing that they catch, the salt in the water is giving them fungal infections and other kinds of infections in their reproductive organs. And a bunch of rogue doctors recently moved in, carrying out hysterectomy on these women, totally debilitating their lives. So much so that my feminist friends are trying to pressure the governments into bringing laws in to regulate hysterectomy. Now, I would have never connected hysterectomy with climate change. What happens to your uterus? And then in that sense, the personal, but your the capacity of that part of your body to be infected by fungi, that is deep history. As Anthony Fauci used to say, one of the reasons why the coronavirus could get to us was because having lived in, let's say, guts of bats or other mammals, had already kind of prepared it, oriented it towards our mammalian cells. Right? So you begin to see, sometimes I say the personal is political, but the person, -L, is planetary. In other words, the person of the personal is planetary, while the personal is political. So where do we go from here? And let me show you the sand story. So one of the things, remember that Václav Smil is saying, we can't do without concrete. I mean, you come into the university and you see concrete all around. My university, your university. And concrete is essential to housing too, not just building. Sand is essential to housing. Bill Gates says in his book that if you have to have affordable housing for everybody on the planet, we need to build a New York every year for the next 50 years. And that will mean a lot of sand. And I read, that's my phone telling me, shut up, Mr. Chakrabarty. I will. Okay. The interesting thing about sand is that I read in papers on sand, by researchers who work on sand, humans are now using up sand at a rate that is faster than the rate at which the earth produces sand. So sand is essential to concrete part of the aggregates. You can't use sand from the desert because desert sand is blown by the wind into spherical shapes. They don't bond very well. So you need river sand and sometimes sand from particular beaches. And if you look at the trade in sand, Singapore expanding its territory by using sand, they used to buy sand from Cambodia. Cambodia stopped sending sand to Singapore, and Singapore is buying sand from Europe now. So, now I'm coming back to the India part of my story. So there's a huge amount of illegal dredging of sand, which destroys rivers and destroys the ecology of the riverbanks. If you Google for sand mafia, it's a very familiar expression in India. You see India tops the list. In 2018 and 19, China produced as much cement as the United States produced over all of the 20th century. That's the acceleration. We had 1 billion consumers in 1986. We have about 4. Now, every second billion has been added faster. From 2007, more than half of humanity lives in cities. By the end of the century, we will be a city-dwelling species. So here we are. When I read these books, I see there's almost a conversation going on between human beings as we shape our time, try to understand it. Two kinds of we's. One is the we that was formed in those years when the idea of growth got delinked from the idea of finitude of resources. So that every country began to calculate its GDP and compare GDPs. Amartya Sen came along and said that's a bad way to calculate GDP. Human development should include quality of life, which was a progress. But even he assumed, if you read him on food and facing any proposition that seems Malthusian to him, he'll fall back on technology and on growing more. So there's one we for which there's something non-negotiable, which is, I would say, attachment to the longer, flourishing forms of human life that the more privileged and the luckier amongst us have come to enjoy. But even if you don't think selfishly, but you think altruistically, the value, as I said, long average lifespan depends on there not being child mortality, there not being maternal mortality. Those were the critical, and who would argue against that? And there's another we that is saying, now that we have woken up to the planet has reminded us ourselves that it is there. The seasons matter, the weather matters. How do we rebuild our societies? One of the things, and I'm speaking at the invitation from somebody from architecture. So urban design is one of the things that has been, in my knowledge, quite influenced by this question. And people talk about vertical agriculture, bringing shorter supply chains, creating agriculture in cities. One of the interesting things about that is that you can't grow the main food grains in cities. You can grow certain kinds of herbs, certain kinds of vegetables, which will give you a lot of vitamin C and certain nutritions. But you need the calories that the grains give us. And for that you need agriculture. So we're at this point where it's not only shapes of time, it's the question of how we're going to shape time. And from the level of the personal, like the story of the hysterectomy scandal in West Bengal, to the level of your person being part of deep history, to the level of the regional. What do we do with Amazon forests? What do we do with the Himalayan glaciers? The Himalayan glaciers serve 8 or 9 countries, from Pakistan to Vietnam. But Himalayas have become the most militarized mountain range in the world because of nation-state politics, mainly between India and China. And the glaciers are receding, and we are destroying the mountains. That's why people now, recently we had a crisis of tunnel building in the Himalayas, in India. And we were being reminded that Himalayas are a young, growing mountain. That's why I said the age of the mountain, the question that Wittgenstein thought we wouldn't ask, it's now in the newspapers. Why would newspaper reports carry the age of Himalayas? Who cares? But now we have to care. A young mountain means its insides are less stable. So So how we keep the non-negotiable, which is human life, and the questions of intrahuman justice, all of those things with respect to human life, and also respond to the crisis that this human flourishing has caused to the biosphere, to the life support system of the planet. That is clearly the task of the future. And that's why we need to talk about shaping time. And maybe I'll end there and take questions, and maybe I'll be able to explain things that were not clear. But thank you very much for your patience.
There should be some mics going around like that question. Oh, well, I guess one right next to the mic.
Thank you very much for your presentation. As a historian of fertilizer, it's always nice to hear my technology mentioned.
Where's the question coming from? Oh, there. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I had a question about your contrast between global and planetary. Now, inasmuch as the post-enlightenment intellectual tradition that you referenced contrasts freedom with nature, it strikes me that the post-colonial
Planet with nature.
Sorry?
I contrasted the Earth system with nature. I said the Earth system is not nature.
The post-colonial, it seemed to me, attempted to assign responsibility for states of unfreedom inasmuch as there were explorations with regard to freedom. And that leads me to wonder whether, when thinking through the planetary, even though humans constitute a minority among life forms in the way that you describe it, can we not assign responsibility for geophysical change within the scale of the planetary? Because inasmuch as humans are outnumbered by E. coli, ultimately it's oil corporations that are causing emissions, not E. coli.
Yeah, so in my terms, capitalism is not non-negotiable. But life is. This is what I'm saying. You might want socialism, but you wouldn't want child mortality rates to go up. So I'm trying to see what's non-negotiable in this. So if somebody says the capitalists have caused it, I mean, there might be arguments from the other side as well, but let's say I accept the argument that, I mean, clearly Exxon has a role, clearly the oil companies have a role, clearly the Adanis have a role. I mean, I'm not denying that. But what I was trying to work at, see, sometimes we say there's inaction because there's no political will. Václav Smil himself says that. Or we say that the capitalists are too powerful. So I'm not denying all that. But what I was trying to see in the literature, people coming from very different perspectives. I mean, Bill Gates doesn't have Amartya. He may be influenced by Amartya Sen's perspective, but when Amartya Sen was writing, he was clearly critiquing economists like Solow, or people who are extolling the GDP as an index of how well off people are. So he was therefore saying, let's look at quality of life. And the Human Development Report, actually, UNDP accepted that, which was his lasting contribution. If you look at Martha Nussbaum, Nussbaum is somewhat opposing Sen by saying actually Sen was also opposed to the utilitarian idea of using satisfaction. But I'm saying these people come from different points of view. What I find running through their arguments, either as a rhetoric for justifying what they're asking for, or as something they genuinely believe in. And I do genuinely think that Bill Gates is quite extraordinary in the different efforts he supports around the world. But see, they all, whatever they support, whether they support carbon sequestration, climate engineering, whatever they support, the bottom line they put forward, and there's a sentence, and I'm almost quoting it from memory but verbatim, that he says, I believe every human being deserves a long, healthy and productive life. And what I'm saying, when I look at cancer treatment, when I look at the fight that my colleagues who unfortunately have had to deal with cancer have engaged in, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, but trying to kind of wrest out of cancer's hands a few more years of either product. I mean, I can name two colleagues who both succumbed to cancer, but their books came out after they died. And this was made possible by the treatment, by the discipline. So I'm partly talking about what we have learned to desire, what we have learned to value. So the value seems to me the non-negotiable bit, not the institutions. So even if you imagine different institutions and assign responsibility, I might agree with you or might quibble with you, but that's quibbling. What I find challenging is that I cannot myself think otherwise. As I said, Gandhi did, and I can't bring myself to that position. Whereas all anti-colonial thinkers, nobody reneged on the question of health. And therefore it's almost like a Bergsonian moment for me, where the vital question is what comes through in what I'm reading as the non-negotiable. Because I think the institutions are negotiable. United Nations doesn't clearly work perfectly. The nation state is clearly criticizable. The pandemic raises questions about how much power the WHO should have. Like all of those, the institutional questions are all there. That's why I think the institutions are not non-negotiable. What I ask you to ask yourself and help me ask myself is, what do I do with human life? If 40% of humanity is dependent on modern agriculture for survival, he says it could be up to 50. And if I know that modern agriculture actually destroys a lot of stuff, it produces monoculture, plus pesticides, cause insecticides. Now, there might be, these are not perfect arrangements. But as we think of shaping our futures, where do we go? And it is, I think, our inability to produce a collective political agency on this question, on the non-negotiable, that the techno-fixers use the non-negotiable to justify their techno-fixes. We can discuss it more later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chakrabarty.
Speak up a little bit, yeah.
Thank you, Professor Chakrabarty, for such a luminous presentation. I want to revisit a word, actually, that kind of occurred on the slides a couple of slides ago, when you were talking about being confronted with the creatureliness about existence, especially in the incidents of camel versus people in South Australia, which is as good as any other place for camels to fight humans in some ways. And I'm really curious then about this notion of creatureliness and how it pertains to this valency or negotiation of what is non-negotiable, of life, of death, and the different promises that were presented to us via technology and urbanization that help us, as you mentioned a few times, forget the planet. And I'm just, kind of thinking a lot then about what is it that shifts the imaginaries of what gets to be non-negotiable and what are the terms of engagements for that. And I was wondering whether, if you have anything to share on the moments when something that had appeared to be non-negotiable suddenly became very negotiable.
No, thank you for that question. So I've actually become very interested in the history of how human life becomes a value. And I think it becomes a much stronger, if you look at it, I think it becomes a much stronger value in the second half of the 20th century, right? It couldn't have been a value for the people who created the two world wars. Right? I mean, they might have other values for defending those wars. And when you go back to peasant societies, indigenous societies, you see that death has a very different meaning, very different meanings for those people because they encounter it so much that, like in my colleague Jonathan Lear's book, Radical Hope, he studies the Native American community where actually the most glorious death belongs to a young person who dies defending the tribe. Right? My grandmother See, I'm obviously a post-antibiotic person. So my grandparents had 15 kids. 8 of them died. My parents had 2 because antibiotics had come. Right? Without antibiotics, I would have been dead at 18. I had an infection which only antibiotics could cure. But my grandmother used to have visitations from her dead children. Again, whereas the more we prolong life, the more death becomes a biological fact. Right? I mean, death. So actually, we become a society where it's very difficult to make death meaningful in many ways. So one is a historical question. So how do these things come together? The idea of growth, the idea of justice, human life being a value, and all of those questions. But to give you an example about what kind of politics the non-negotiable could produce. Again, from my region, I give you so just thinking beyond the nation state. I was giving a lecture at UNESCO on this question, and I said, look, why couldn't all the beneficiaries of the rivers coming out of the Himalayas form a multilateral agency to look after the health of the glaciers and get all these nations to cede some authority to that agency in the interest of everybody, because the glaciers in the Himalayas actually have an impact on the Asian monsoon, right? So it's not like simply water. See, one of the problems with people like Robert Solow, great economists and very smart people, was that when they thought, and it's not fault because we've become aware of this more and more in the 80s. In the 70s, they used to still think resources as oil and coal as unrelated. So they used to think a particular resource on its own. What we have gradually realized is that we are dealing with a much more interactive planet, where things are more connected to each other, right? So I mean, it's a very humble example, but everybody tells me it will be damn difficult to do because of the pressure of nation states to get that kind of multiplier. So anyway, those are 2 answers to your question. Thank you.
I think we can continue conversation upstairs, but
Okay.
please join me in thanking again.